Hi, I'm Cliff Perkins. I'm a retired lawyer in Carrollton and have been in the poetry workshop with the cultural arts here in Carrollton for about 10 years. I'm going to address several questions this morning. One is writer's block. The question was, well, how do you solve writer's block? How do you get around it? My answer is don't. I think poetry is a muse. We need to be enthusiastic about our poetry. That word comes from the Greek, meaning possessed by a god. So we're more receivers than givers. We receive the poetry, I think. You have to be open to receiving, and then that's when the block goes away. Another question is, how do you know when you've got your final draft of your poem? You've worked on it, and when is it right? Again, my answer is pretty simple. It's my final draft is when I die, because I find that that every time I go back and look at a poem, I tend to change it. I believe there are no final drafts, and I think that's a good thing, because it's the journey, not the destination, and it's fun to keep playing with them. A third question is about what advice would you give to a new poet? The first thing I would say is, and we have people come to like our workshop, and I remember when I first came, you feel intimidated. You got all these people that have been writing and reciting their poems for years, but don't, because, as I say, there are no perfect poems, and I would advise a new poet definitely to get involved in some kind of workshop like we have in Carrollton, hey, they let me in and they let me stay for 10 years, so apparently they just let anybody in. And it's a lot of fun. People come, they read their poems, and that kind of leads into the next question. Has the writer's skill improved by writing, or is it a helpful thing? And I think it definitely is helpful. It combines two things: honest critique, which is important to receive criticism, but it's softened by love. The poetry workshop itself kind of reminds me of Alcoholics Anonymous, in that it's a bunch of people who realize we're not perfect. We wouldn't be there if we thought we were. And so we're willing to be honest with each other and tell someone when we think something would improve their poem, but we also are loving in that we understand that not just there, but for the grace of God go I, but that actually when I recite my poem, somebody's going to need to critique it too, because it needs some. The final question I address is, how important is accessibility of meaning? Or another way, should you have to work hard to solve a poem? And I think that kind of breaks down into two ideas: clarity and complexity. I think you start with the idea with the KISS principle, K-I-S-S, keep it simple, stupid, and keep it clear. The famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, poets muddy their waters to make them appear deep. And there is some truth in that because if you think that your poem needs to be complex just for complexity's sake, then you're going to end up with a stilted and pretentious poem. Poems can be very simple, just like Robert Browning's poem Pippa's Song. There's nothing complicated about it. He's just describing spring, the years at the spring, the days at the mornings at 7, And I forget the rest of the poem, and I didn't bring it with me, but that'll give you an idea. But then, so that's about clarity. Clarity is crucial. But then complexity can be good too. If it's just for its own sake, it's bad. But if there are reasons for things to be complex. One is, poetry can be fun. And one thing is just, if the reader has to solve the poem, it's like solving a puzzle. People enjoy that. Another reason for complexity is to get the reader's attention. It's kind of like in advertising where they'll misspell words. And I've done that, and other people have done that in poems, or used the wrong word. I wrote a poem in which I talked about, I took the idea of where Jesus was walking along and someone touched the hem of his garment, and he knew he had been touched even though they didn't touch him. And that was the last line in my poem about, it was kind of a love poem about my beloved touching me, and it said, "You touched the hem of my garment." That was the last line. But instead of H-E-M, him, I put H-Y-M. There are two M's in that word? Anyway, for a religious song. You also, complexity can involve the reader. That's kind of like the puzzle idea, but you don't want, if you're the reader or you're the hearer, you don't want it all on a silver platter. That's boring. That leaves nothing to your imagination as the reader. You want the reader to become an active participant in the adventure that your poem is. Your poem should be an adventure for you and for the reader. Other ideas of complexity are like using metaphor or allusion. T.S. Eliot used tons of that. You refer to other people's poems. I think that's a good thing often because it can allow you to pack a lot of information for your reader into your poem. If they're familiar with that other poem or that other idea, you don't have to lay it all out for them. And then finally, you want complexity. You want to make it complex enough that that it's appetizing to the reader. And there's a reason for that, because there's a reason you're writing. You want to be heard. You feel like you have something worthwhile or beautiful or important to say. And so try to balance all those things, the clarity and the complexity. I have just one example of a poem I wrote that I've talked some about kind of imperfection a little bit today, us all being imperfect poets. And that is an idea that appeals to me. I know in Christianity, perfection really means wholeness. It doesn't mean all just goodness. It means wholeness. And the idea that that God came down to earth to be as a human was imperfection. I ended up writing this poem I called Poor God. Poor God, too totally complete, too perfectly whole. No wonder you were cruel. Each king needs a fool. All present, you can never know absence of a lover or a friend, or joy at their return. All knowing, you can experience epiphany or bliss of ignorance. Most high, you could never climb a mountain or a tree or hill of Calvary. What more could you want? Excuse me, the light's kind of funny here and I'm having trouble reading my own poem. What more could you want? Having all there is, an olive mount, a traitor's kiss. No wonder you came down to wear that thorny crown.